For the frontiersmen of the 1800s, the very first priority when facing a brutal winter in the wilderness wasn't food or fire, it was shelter. Without protection from the elements, hypothermia could set in within hours. The early settlers knew this well, and they developed a wide variety of techniques to create strong, insulated shelters using only what nature provided. The most common winter structure was the log cabin, built from thick timber logs cut using axes and hand saws. Frontiersmen would carefully select trees, usually pine or spruce, that were tall, straight, and easy to split. The trees were then felled and stripped of bark. With incredible skill, they notched each log so they interlocked tightly at the corners, stacking them one by one to form the walls. These logs were heavy, often requiring teamwork to lift and position. But the walls alone weren't enough. To seal out the cold, they used mud, moss, and clay to fill in the gaps, a process called chinking. This not only kept the freezing wind from entering the shelter, but also helped trap heat inside. The roofs were angled steeply to prevent snow from piling up and collapsing the structure, and they were insulated with overlapping wooden shingles or even layers of bark and straw when resources were scarce. In situations where time or resources were limited, such as during travel or emergencies, frontiersmen often constructed quick shelters like lean-tos or brush lodges. A lean-to was built by slanting large branches against a standing log or rock wall, then layering smaller branches, pine boughs, and packed snow to act as insulation. This design blocked the wind on one side and reflected heat from a nearby fire back into the shelter. Pine needles and dry leaves were used as bedding and floor insulation to keep the body elevated above the snow-covered ground. In extreme cases, some settlers would dig into hillsides or snowbanks to create pit shelters or dugouts, using the earth's natural insulation to stay warm. These primitive earth homes were often hidden and silent, perfect for conserving heat and avoiding detection by wildlife or hostile forces. Every shelter was a combination of resourcefulness, physical labor, and deep understanding of the environment. The frontiersmen didn't just build homes, they engineered survival zones in the middle of frozen, untamed landscapes. Their knowledge of where to place the shelter, such as near tree lines for wind protection or next to streams for water access, was as vital as the materials they used. Their lives quite literally depended on their ability to turn nature into a shield. Surviving a harsh winter in the 1800s meant more than just finding shelter, it required mastering the ancient art of insulation, all without the luxury of modern materials like fiberglass, thermal blankets, or insulated walls. For frontiersmen, warmth wasn't a matter of comfort, it was a matter of life and death. They had to be creative, precise, and deeply connected to the land to trap every bit of heat they could manage. Their first line of defense against the cold was natural insulation, often harvested directly from their environment. One of the most common materials was moss. Found in abundance along the trunks of trees and damp forest floors, moss was thick, soft, and surprisingly effective at plugging gaps in walls, roofs, and even clothing. It was stuffed between logs in cabins and layered between bark shingles to keep wind and snow out. Unlike straw or hay, moss didn't easily catch fire, which made it a safer choice for homes built near indoor flames. Another powerful insulator was pine boughs. Not only were they used for bedding, layered thickly on the ground to keep the sleeper off the frozen soil, but they were also bundled and stacked against walls or on top of shelters to add extra protection. The air trapped between the pine needles created a buffer zone, reducing the loss of body heat. Inside shelters, settlers often built false walls using animal hides or thick cloth to divide the space and contain warmth to a smaller area. These hide curtains were sometimes soaked in animal fat to help repel moisture and were hung around beds or sleeping areas to create mini heat chambers. Animal furs, especially from bear, beaver, and deer, were essential for lining sleeping spaces, wrapping around bodies, and even hanging over entryways to stop cold air from rushing in. Clothing was also part of the insulation strategy. In a time when wool was precious and manufactured fabrics were rare, frontiersmen relied on layered animal pelts and homespun garments. They would wear multiple shirts, sometimes woven from coarse flax or wool, under thick outer layers made of tanned deer or elk skin. Hoods lined with fur helped retain body heat, and mittens were often sewn from rabbit pelts or sheepskin, with the fur turned inward for maximum warmth. Feet, often the first to freeze, were specially protected. Instead of socks, many pioneers would stuff their boots with dried grass or cattail fluff, which absorbed sweat and provided both cushioning and warmth. This method, borrowed from Native American tribes, helped prevent frostbite during long treks across snow-covered terrain. Even the fire itself was insulated. Settlers would dig fire pits below ground level, surrounding them with stones that retained heat. In some cases, hot rocks were wrapped in cloth and placed under bedding at night to act like primitive hot water bottles. Any heat generated was conserved and redirected, never wasted. All of these insulation techniques demonstrate not only the ingenuity of the frontier people, but their deep observation of nature. They didn't rely on factories or supply chains. They studied how animals survived, tested methods in brutal conditions, and passed these life-saving skills down through generations. In the frozen wilderness of the 1800s, fire wasn't just a luxury, it was survival in its purest form. For the American frontiersmen, starting a fire under freezing, snow-covered conditions required more than just luck. It demanded skill, patience, and a deep understanding of both the environment and the tools at hand. When temperatures plummeted and the wind howled through the trees, a reliable fire meant warmth, cooked food, light, and often the difference between life and death. Starting a fire in wet, frozen terrain was one of the most difficult challenges faced by any settler. They didn't have lighters or waterproof matches. Instead, they relied on primitive tools like flint and steel, charcloth, dry tinder, and the most underrated survival skill, preparation. Charcloth, for example, was a vital component of any frontiersman's fire kit. It was typically made by placing small pieces of cotton or linen in a tin container with a tiny vent hole, then setting it in the fire to bake. The process would char the cloth, turning it into a highly flammable material that could catch even the tiniest spark. This spark was then transferred to a tinder bundle, a delicate nest made from dry grass, shaved bark, pine needles, or cattail fluff. The moment the char cloth glowed red, it was carefully placed inside this bundle and gently blown on until it ignited into a flame. But the challenge didn't end there. In snowy, damp conditions, dry fuel was hard to find. Experienced woodsmen knew to search for standing deadwood, branches or small trees that had died while upright, keeping them drier than anything lying on the forest floor. The inner bark of birch trees was a favorite fire starter due to its natural oils, which allowed it to burn even when slightly damp. Resin-rich pine knots and fatwood were also highly sought after for their ability to ignite quickly and burn hot. In deep snow, building a fire directly on the ground was a recipe for failure. As the fire melted the snow, it would sink, sputter, and die out. To avoid this, pioneers constructed fire platforms by laying down a foundation of green logs or flat stones. This elevated the fire above the snow and allowed air to circulate beneath, keeping the flames alive. Sometimes, they even dug out a pit in the snow, lined it with bark or rocks, and used this cavity as a wind-blocked hearth. Wind protection was critical. A strong gust could snuff out an ember in seconds. Frontiersmen often used natural windbreaks like rock outcroppings, fallen logs, or snowbanks to shield their fires. In more exposed areas, they would build walls of snow or logs to create a pocket of still air where the fire could thrive. Some would go as far as using their own bodies to block the wind while the fire took hold, risking frostbite for a vital flame. The act of fire starting was often a ritual of survival, methodical, tense, and deeply rooted in experience. It could take 10 minutes or an hour, depending on the conditions. But once that flame roared to life, it became a symbol of hope and control in an otherwise unforgiving world. A fire in the winter wilderness wasn't just heat, it was a lifeline, a protector, a signal of human presence in the wild. It allowed the frontier survivor to cook, dry clothes, purify water, and most importantly, keep the cold and death at bay. Each successful fire was a triumph of knowledge over nature, and every spark a small miracle forged from the harshest conditions. To most, snow is a symbol of hardship, a white blanket that smothers the land, freezes the bones, and buries all hope of comfort. But to the seasoned frontiersmen of the 1800s, snow was far more than a frozen obstacle. It was a versatile tool, a resource to be mastered rather than feared. These survivalists didn't just battle the snow, they used it to live. One of the most surprising survival secrets on the frontier was understanding that snow could act as insulation. While it might seem counterintuitive, snow's fluffy structure traps pockets of air, creating a thermal barrier against wind and cold. Frontiersmen would often build snow walls around their shelters, especially on the windward side, to block icy gusts. In more severe environments, they carved out snow caves or dugouts, burrowing into snowbanks to create insulated shelters that could be 40 to 50 degrees warmer than the outside temperature, even without a fire. Snow was also used to reinforce lean-tos and brush shelters. After building a basic frame from logs and branches, Pioneers would pile snow on the outer walls and roof. As it hardened, this snowpack became a solid shell that shielded the structure from wind and helped retain heat inside. Some even used this technique to camouflage their shelters from predators or hostile forces. Water was another critical need, and in the depths of winter, streams and rivers often froze solid. Melting snow for drinking water became an essential daily task, but it had to be done carefully. Experienced woodsmen knew that eating raw snow would lower their core body temperature and could lead to hypothermia. Instead, they placed small amounts of snow in metal pots and hung them over fires, letting it melt slowly. To speed up the process and conserve fuel, they often added a small amount of liquid water to the pot first, allowing the snow to melt more efficiently and avoid scorching the bottom. Snow also served as a cooling agent for preserving meat. In the absence of refrigeration, game meat, such as venison, rabbit, or beaver, was stored in dugout snow pits or wrapped in cloth and packed under thick layers of snow. This primitive refrigeration could keep food edible for weeks, if not longer. Tracking and hunting in snow became both easier and more strategic. Frontiersmen learned to read tracks in the snow like a book. A single trail of rabbit prints could lead to a nest, while heavy, deep indentations might reveal the presence of moose or elk. The direction, freshness, and depth of tracks helped the frontiersman estimate when an animal had passed, how fast it was moving, and even whether it was wounded or resting. In combat situations, snow also betrayed human movement. Footprints could lead to enemy camps or reveal if a path was recently traveled. Snow was also used to dampen sound, giving stealth advantages in hunting or in times of conflict. A heavy snowfall could muffle footsteps, allowing hunters to approach prey silently. In dense woods, this could mean the difference between going hungry or returning with enough meat to feed a camp. For sanitation, snow served practical purposes as well. It was used to clean tools, wash hands, or act as a temporary sponge. And in the absence of toilet paper or water, settlers used it as a rudimentary but effective hygiene solution. Even during rest, snow played a role. Frontiersmen would dig shallow trenches in the snow to place their bedding, then build fires nearby and use hot stones or embers to warm their sleeping areas. They used snowbanks as windbreaks, natural backrests, or even partial roofs when combined with pine boughs and bark. To the untrained eye, snow was just cold and cruel. But to the frontier survivor, it was raw potential, something that could be shaped, used, and trusted. Snow was more than an element. It was a silent companion in the wild, dangerous but valuable, frozen but full of possibilities. In the unforgiving cold of the frontier winter, food wasn't just about taste or tradition, it was pure survival. The frontiersman's body, constantly exposed to freezing winds and relentless snow, burned calories at a relentless pace. Keeping warm meant staying fed, and staying fed meant learning how to cook in some of the harshest conditions nature could throw at a human being. Winter cooking in the 1800s wasn't done in cozy kitchens or around cast-iron stoves. It took place outdoors, in wind-blown camps, beneath open skies, or inside rudimentary shelters with fires carefully tended in handmade hearths. The men and women who braved the frozen wilderness had to develop rugged, reliable cooking techniques that worked even when the snow was falling and wood was damp. The most critical tool of all was the open fire. It provided heat for the body, light for the eyes, and a platform for preparing meals. In freezing temperatures, fire pits had to be strategically dug, either above ground on wood platforms or recessed into snowbanks and lined with stones to retain heat. These stones were heated and used to keep water from freezing or to slow-cook meals over long nights. Food was often cooked in hanging iron pots, suspended over flames using tripod rigs made from sturdy branches. These versatile pots were used to boil snow into drinking water, simmer stews, or slow-cook tough cuts of meat. A popular technique involved making soups and broths, which not only helped hydrate the body but also preserved the nutritional value of whatever ingredients were available. Bone broth, in particular, was common, made by boiling game bones for hours to extract fats and minerals vital for endurance in sub-zero weather. Roasting over open flame was another staple of frontier cuisine. Game meat, rabbits, squirrels, birds, or deer, was skewered on greenwood sticks or laid across improvised grates made from green branches or iron rods. The key was to keep the meat turning, avoiding the intense flame and using hot coals to cook it evenly without burning. This method required constant attention but produced high-calorie meals essential for energy and warmth. When snow buried the land and hunting was scarce, frontiersmen turned to their preserved supplies. Salted pork, smoked venison, jerky, dried beans, and hardtack were staples that could be carried and cooked quickly. Dried beans would be soaked and boiled slowly for hours, absorbing the smoky flavor of the fire and transforming into hearty, protein-rich stews. Cornmeal, when available, was used to make basic flatbreads or hoe cakes, cooked on hot stones beside the fire. In some areas, more elaborate methods were used, including earth ovens, shallow pits dug into the ground, filled with hot stones, and covered with meat or roots wrapped in bark or leaves. These were then buried under soil and snow to trap the heat, creating a primitive slow cooker that could produce tender, warm meals over several hours. This technique was particularly useful for larger game or when feeding a group. For the frontiersmen who had access to traps, small game and fish were frequent meals. Trout caught through holes in frozen rivers were roasted whole. Trapped beaver, muskrat, or porcupine were cleaned and cooked with whatever roots or herbs could be found, though seasoning was minimal. The natural flavors of the wilderness were often the only spices available. And then there were the rare moments of comfort, like hot tea made from pine needles, rich in vitamin C, or cowboy coffee brewed by throwing coarse grounds into boiling water and letting it settle at the bottom of the pot. Sometimes, snow was melted into the pot and a small piece of bacon fat was added for richness. Even in brutal conditions, a hot drink could lift spirits and restore focus. Cooking in winter was not simply about filling the stomach. It was about fueling the body to survive, to gather more firewood, trap more animals, dig deeper snow trenches, or withstand one more frozen night in the wilderness. Every bite was earned, and every meal was a testament to human resilience and ingenuity. In the icy grip of the American frontier winter, shelter and fire could only do so much. A frontiersman's most constant line of defense against the killing cold was what he wore on his body. And in the 1800s, there were no synthetic fabrics, no thermal linings, no insulated boots from a factory. Survival demanded that clothing be carefully chosen, often handcrafted, and strategically layered using only what nature provided. Every piece of clothing had a purpose. Every layer was a calculated choice. The frontiersmen had to adapt their attire to match not just the cold, but the wind, snow, wet conditions, and the physical labor of living outdoors. Their clothing wasn't fashionable, it was functional armor against the elements. The base layer often began with hand-spun wool shirts, if such a luxury could be afforded. Wool was prized for its ability to retain warmth even when wet. However, many frontiersmen didn't have access to wool year-round, especially in remote regions. In such cases, linens or flax-based undergarments served as the first layer, offering at least a basic barrier between skin and the cold. Over that came the hide garments, shirts and pants made from the tanned skins of deer, elk, or moose. Buckskin was particularly popular. Tough yet flexible, it provided both warmth and protection from the wet. These garments were often sewn by hand using sinew, and many incorporated fringe, not just for style, but for function, allowing water to drip off the edges and helping the clothing dry faster in snowy or rainy conditions. In severe cold, layering was critical. Furs were added on top, thick, insulating outer garments made from bear, buffalo, beaver, or raccoon hides. These coats and cloaks were heavy, but they held body heat and repelled snow like a natural parka. The fur was often turned inward, facing the body, while the outer leather acted as a weather-resistant shell. The head was never left exposed. Frontiersmen wore fur-lined caps, often fashioned after traditional Native American styles. These hats had flaps that could be tied down over the ears and back of the neck. In deadly blizzards, a full fur hood or scarf made from wolf or coyote fur was added, allowing the wearer to breathe through a narrow slit, reducing the risk of frostbite. Hands were just as vulnerable as the face. The pioneers crafted mittens and gloves from animal pelts, such as rabbit, muskrat, or deerskin, with the fur side often facing inward. Mittens were favored over gloves in extreme cold because they allowed fingers to share warmth. When skinning animals or chopping wood, tougher exterior mitts could be worn over softer liners, providing both dexterity and protection. But perhaps nowhere was winter clothing more vital than on the feet. Wet, frozen feet could spell death within hours. Thick leather moccasins or boots were worn, often layered with multiple socks, wool if available, otherwise wrapped cloth. Still, this wasn't enough. The real ingenuity came from stuffing the boots with dried grass, moss, or cattail fluff. This natural insulation helped trap heat and absorb sweat. It was a trick learned from Native American tribes and one that saved countless toes from frostbite. Leg coverings often included wool or fur-lined leggings, and in deep snow, leather gaiters or wraps were used to seal the tops of the boots, preventing snow from slipping inside. When traveling in heavy snowfall, men used snowshoes made of wood and rawhide, strapped to their boots to distribute their weight and prevent sinking. Every morning, getting dressed wasn't a routine, it was a preparation for battle. Frontiersmen inspected their garments for tears, moisture, or damage. A wet sleeve could freeze stiff, a torn moccasin could let in frost, and a missing glove could mean a frozen hand by nightfall. These clothes weren't mass-produced or disposable. They were often sewn by hand, repaired dozens of times, and tailored specifically to the wearer's body and lifestyle. Many frontier families passed down garments through generations or traded hides for skilled tailoring by Native American artisans who had perfected the art of cold-weather clothing over centuries. To the modern eye, this wardrobe may seem crude, but to the frontier survivor, each layer, each fur, and each thread meant survival. Clothing was not about fashion, it was about endurance. It was a second skin, a barrier against the deadly silence of the snow-covered world, and a reminder that out here, nature showed no mercy and the frigid silence of the frontier winter, where snow blanketed the land and rivers froze solid, securing food became a relentless pursuit. For the frontiersman, hunger was not just a discomfort, it was a threat as real and as lethal as any storm. Hunting and trapping in such hostile conditions was not a sport, nor a luxury. It was a test of skill, knowledge, and unyielding determination. Every meal had to be earned through effort, intuition, and grit. As the temperature dropped and the ground hardened, crops disappeared, game became scarce, and edible vegetation was buried beneath layers of snow. In such times, frontiersmen turned to traps and primitive hunting tools, not because they preferred them, but because efficiency was essential. Firewood still had to be chopped, shelters repaired, and water melted. Long, energy-draining chases after prey in deep snow could cost more calories than they returned. So instead, they laid traps, silent, patient, and ever ready. The most commonly used traps were snares, crafted from cordage made of twisted sinew, rawhide, or even braided horsehair. These were placed along game trails, the narrow paths carved into the snow by rabbits, foxes, or other small animals. Frontiersmen learned to recognize the signs: fresh tracks, droppings, gnawed twigs, and disturbed snow. They'd bend saplings into tension and trigger them with baited loops, designed to catch an animal by the neck or leg the moment it investigated. Deadfall traps were another staple of the frontier toolkit. Constructed using heavy logs or stones balanced on carefully placed sticks, these traps would crush smaller animals instantly when triggered. Baited with bits of meat, fat, or even scent-laced cloth, they could catch everything from squirrels to martens. These passive hunting systems allowed the settler to conserve energy, checking lines and resetting traps while performing other survival tasks. When it came to larger prey, such as deer, elk, or moose, hunting became an art of patience and precision. Winter made tracking easier. Fresh hoof prints in snow, broken branches, and blood spots told a vivid story. But it also made the hunt more dangerous. Wounded animals could run miles before falling, and following them meant risking exposure, frostbite, or getting lost in a whiteout. Frontiersmen used black powder muskets or long rifles for larger game. In closer quarters, bows and arrows, sometimes borrowed from or learned directly from Native American allies, offered a quieter approach. Arrows were often fletched with feathers and tipped with hand-forged iron or flint heads, and bows were crafted from hickory, ash, or elm. For fishing, winter was no barrier, it was simply a different game. Frontiersmen carved ice holes into frozen lakes or rivers and used sharpened spears or hand lines baited with grubs or scraps. Ice fishing was slow but productive, and a single trout or pike could feed a man for an entire day. But food wasn't always abundant, and in lean times, even animals considered unappetizing became life-saving meals. Porcupines, muskrats, and skunks were trapped and cooked when options ran thin. In moments of desperation, frontiersmen boiled bones for broth, ground up acorns or cattail roots for makeshift flour, and gnawed on strips of dried sinew or old leather softened by boiling. Preservation was also critical. Meat had to last through weeks or months of snowbound isolation. Frontiersmen smoked meat over slow-burning fires, salted and dried it into jerky, or buried it in snow-lined pits, wrapped in bark or cloth to keep it cold and protected from scavengers. None of this was accidental. Success in hunting and trapping required deep knowledge of animal behavior, seasonal patterns, and local terrain. Frontiersmen often adopted or adapted techniques from Native American tribes, whose understanding of wilderness survival far exceeded anything found in books or towns. From them, the pioneers learned how to call birds, mimic animal sounds, and interpret subtle signs in the snow that marked a hidden den or feeding ground. Every successful hunt meant more than a full belly, it meant survival for another day. Every trap that snapped shut was another chance to keep the fire going, to warm the bones, to build strength against the ever-present cold. Hunting and trapping weren't just skills, they were acts of resilience, a daily battle against starvation and the unforgiving wild. On the winter frontier, even taking a single step could be an act of defiance against nature. When snow reached waist height, trails vanished, and the world turned into a vast white void, navigation and movement became battles in their own right. Yet, frontiersmen, driven by necessity, survival, or exploration, continued to move across frozen landscapes, developing brilliant methods to travel and find their way in one of the harshest terrains on Earth. Traveling in deep snow without preparation was a death sentence. The snow could swallow a man's legs with each step, sap his strength, and bury his trail within hours of a snowfall. The earliest settlers quickly realized they needed a solution, so they turned to a skill perfected over centuries by Native American tribes: snowshoes. Snowshoes were among the most essential tools of winter mobility. These large, lightweight frames, often crafted from bent ash wood and laced with strips of rawhide, distributed the wearer's weight over a wider surface, preventing them from sinking into the snow. The designs varied by region. Some were long and narrow for open plains, others were round and compact for maneuvering in dense forests. Mastering snowshoe walking wasn't immediate. It required balance, rhythm, and strength. But once learned, it allowed a man to cover miles of snow-covered ground that would have otherwise been impossible to cross. In addition to snowshoes, makeshift sleds, often referred to as travois or pull sleds, were built to carry firewood, meat, tools, or even the weak and injured. Pulled by hand, dog, or horse when possible, these sleds helped lighten the frontiersman's burden and preserve energy during long treks. Runners were greased with animal fat to glide more smoothly across icy surfaces, and loads were lashed down tightly to prevent tipping on uneven snowbanks or sloped trails. Navigation, too, became a unique challenge. Without visible landmarks or sun on cloudy days, whiteouts could disorient even the most experienced woodsman. The frontiersmen had to rely on natural markers and instincts, often passed down through generations or learned from Native American guides. They tracked wind direction, tree moss patterns, and the position of stars at night. When the sky was clear, the sun's arc gave clues to direction, but when it vanished, settlers used the shape of snowdrifts, which were often formed by consistent winds, as rough compasses. Many men left trail signs behind them, cut notches in trees, snapped branches pointing the way, or created distinct boot prints that doubled back to form arrows. In dangerous terrain, a string might be tied from one tree to another to prevent losing one's way back, especially during blizzards or nighttime travel. Even the snow itself told a story. Experienced frontiersmen could read layers of snow to assess safety, whether it had frozen hard overnight, softened from underneath, or threatened to collapse under its own weight. These observations could determine whether it was safe to travel across frozen rivers, climb ridges, or set up camp on a snowbank. The wrong judgment could send a man plunging through thin ice or collapsing into an unseen hollow. In areas frequented by wild animals or hostile forces, movement had to be both stealthy and strategic. Tracks in the snow were a double-edged sword. They could help a man follow prey, but also made him easy to follow. Frontiersmen often covered their trails by walking backward, brushing out footprints with pine branches, or choosing paths along icy streams where prints wouldn't stick. Travel wasn't just about distance, it was about time. The wilderness winter days were short, and once the sun dipped below the trees, temperatures dropped dangerously fast. Timing every journey to reach a known shelter or safe resting spot before nightfall became a non-negotiable rule. If one miscalculated and had to camp in the open, it could mean frostbite, starvation, or never waking up. Despite these dangers, travel remained a lifeline, whether for hunting, trading, checking trap lines, or reaching family and settlements miles apart. The frontiersmen knew that standing still was often more dangerous than moving forward. With every step, they adapted, learned, and fought to move not just through the snow, but through the very edge of what was humanly possible. When people think of frontier survival in the 1800s, they often picture snowstorms, wild animals, and bitter cold, but one of the most dangerous threats didn't come from the outside world. It came from within the human mind. Isolation, loneliness, and the relentless silence of winter could eat away at a person's sanity just as surely as frostbite consumed fingers and toes. For the frontiersman, learning to survive the psychological toll of solitude was as essential as knowing how to build a fire or hunt game. Life on the frontier, especially during winter, was a life of extreme loneliness. Settlers could go weeks, sometimes even months, without seeing another soul. Trappers working remote traplines, homesteaders snowed in miles from the nearest neighbor, or hunters wintering in mountain cabins all faced the same challenge, enduring the crushing quiet of a world where nothing moved but the wind and the snow. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, unbroken, and unnatural for men used to the noise of towns, families, or even wildlife. In the stillness, the mind became loud. Thoughts spiraled. Doubts crept in. Memories, both comforting and haunting, replayed endlessly. The cold made the body ache, but it was the isolation that made the soul hurt. To combat this, frontiersmen developed mental strategies born from discipline, repetition, and an understanding of their emotional limits. Routine became a lifeline. They divided their days with purpose, collecting firewood at a set time, checking traps on a fixed schedule, boiling water or mending gear each evening. These tasks, though small, gave shape to their days and helped prevent the mental fog that could lead to despair. Many relied on journaling or carving marks into wood or stone to track time. In a world without calendars or clocks, this gave them a sense of progress, a visual reminder that they were surviving one day at a time. Others sang to themselves, recited prayers, or told stories aloud to fill the air and fight the creeping emptiness. For spiritual and emotional grounding, faith played a powerful role. Many frontiersmen carried pocket Bibles or books of Psalms. Reading scripture or repeating verses gave them a sense of connection, not just to God, but to the families and communities they had left behind. Faith was more than comfort, it was mental armor, helping them endure when the physical body was worn thin. The changing landscape also provided psychological support. Observing how snow melted from the south-facing slope first, or how the stars shifted in the night sky, reminded the frontiersman that time was moving forward. Nature became both companion and counselor. Watching a fox trot through the trees or a bird call at dawn reminded them they were not entirely alone. Still, not everyone could withstand the mental strain. There are documented accounts of men abandoning cabins midwinter, walking into the forest without reason or direction, driven mad by the silence and solitude. Others became so paranoid or withdrawn they were unrecognizable when finally found. The wilderness did not only freeze bodies, it isolated minds, and not all emerged intact.